Today, just something a little bit different. I have a relatively new YouTuber who's just burst onto the scene with some fantastic content regarding propertarianism and other stuff that is similar. Name is John Mark, the man with the red helmet. If you haven't seen his channel, I will link to it in the description. The content is great. Discusses mainly things like propertarianism, as I said, but also predicting the future of conflict in the United States of America and other interesting topics such as that. So I've just got him here on the channel today, just asking a few questions and learn a little bit more about where he's coming from and the ideas that he's talking about. So John Mark, thank you very much for joining us here over the Pacific Ocean in Australia.
Very good to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Maddie.
No problem at all. So just wanted to start, can you just explain exactly what propertarianism is to someone who might never have heard of it before?
I think the easiest way to explain it from a 30,000-foot view is kind of the end result of it. The end result of it, there's kind of a lot that goes into it, but the end result is what I would simply call an improved system of rule of law. Some improvements in rule of law. So very quickly, I'll try not to get too in the weeds, but just a really quick overview. I usually try to get across to people 3 improvements in rule of law. And by the way, in case your audience doesn't know, your very own Maddie here has done a video that does a great job of explaining propertarianism as well. So I highly recommend that. But the way I try to explain it is to just share these 3 improvements in rule of law. And people can kind of go and explore it from there. But the first one is a broader definition of property. Right now, our rule of law basically just treats property as physical stuff. Physical stuff is property, maybe something like intellectual property, that type of thing, an invention or something. Propertarianism says that's not sufficient because that's not how human beings act. The way human beings act is they act to defend a lot of things that they value, and they value a lot of things that are not just physical stuff. So they might value a religion, they might value their genes, their group's genes, they might value their nation's low crime rate, something like that. And so people will act to defend those things that they value. And so propertarianism tries to be empirical about it and say, what do people actually treat as property? And let's call that property. So that's the first improvement in rule of law. The reason that's an improvement is because there's all sorts of retaliation cycles, as we can see now in Western civilization, where here in America, where I am, we're probably going to end up with a civil war because of it. And it's because our rule of law does not stop these retaliation cycles from happening, which is the job of rule of law. And the reason our rule of law is not stopping those retaliation cycles from happening is because the definition of property in our rule of law is not sufficient to cover all the things that people would fight over, if that makes sense. So that's very high level. That's number one. Number two, we say that empirically, morality is reciprocity. We have what we call the non-parasitism principle. You could also just call it natural law of reciprocity. And it's a simple definition with 4 or 5 criteria that an interaction or a transaction between 2 human beings or 2 groups of human beings has to meet those particular criteria. And if not, it is not a reciprocal transaction. And if it's not a reciprocal transaction, somebody's going to get pissed and a retaliation cycle is going to start. So we say that the goal of rule of law is to enforce reciprocity in transactions between human beings. And so if you want to think of a practical example that already exists, business contract law is already very much like this. And so it seeks to extend that, combined with the broader definition of property, into a broader sphere of life, not just the business world, if that makes sense. And again, the goal is to stop retaliation cycles. And when you stop the retaliation cycles, you start having a high trust society. So the difference between first world countries and third world countries largely is first world countries have better rule of law. They have stamped out more parasitism. They have forced more people to operate in reciprocity rather than violating reciprocity. And so it's kind of a libertarian thing in the sense of it. The basic gist of it is don't steal, but it's much broader than libertarianism, if that makes sense. So that's the second one, is really making the judiciary just act as an enforcer of reciprocity in interactions between the people and the polity. And then the third is under propertarian law, public figures could be sued for lying. So everything that a public figure would say would have to be able to pass several falsehood tests. And so they don't have to prove that what they're saying is true, because that's very difficult, but they just have to be able to demonstrate in court that they've done due diligence on what they're saying, so they're not blatantly lying by omission, for example. And so there's a few falsehood tests that everything they say would have to pass. And if they don't do it, if what they say is can't pass those tests, and if it causes any kind of harm or causes any risk to anyone, they can be sued. In the same way that a car company can be sued if they put out cars with faulty brakes, right? It treats information as a commodity. And so this would clean up our information, our informational commons is the term we would use, in a fantastic way in Western civilization, or wherever we would be able to implement something like this, because it basically would stop parasitic people from using lies to rally people. You wouldn't be able to say things like diversity is our strength. You wouldn't be able to say things like, you know, the reason black people in America aren't as successful as white people is because it's only because white people are evil, that type of thing. You just wouldn't be able to get away with saying things like that. So those are the three improvements in rule of law. That's a 30,000-foot view. I would say there's definitely more to it than that, but definitely check out Maddie's video on it. And I have an introductory video on it as well, that if you watch those two videos, I think you'll have a pretty good idea what it's about.
And yeah, definitely watch. People should definitely watch your video on it. I think it's about an hour long, so there's a bit of time, but it does go quite in depth into everything. What I really love about all of it, obviously, I like the idea of ending parasitism, like you said, but the main thing I really love the most is the fact that they make deliberate lying by public figures against the law. So that would clean up first politicians and the media. And I think the biggest issue that we've got in Western civilization and have had since almost the end of World War II is that our public figures just lie for a living. All they ever do is tell untruths repeatedly and without shame as well. And it gets to the point where a guy in Australia, we spoke about this before we started, but a guy like Fraser Anning will come out and all he has to do is tell the truth. And the people in power just go nuts because it's like George Orwell said, in times of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. So I'd love the idea of making it illegal to lie if you are a public, or deliberately lie if you're a public figure. Not, you know, you're still allowed to be wrong or have an opinion that other people don't like. So you're allowed to freely express your own honestly held opinions, but what you're not allowed to do is knowingly lie. I think that's absolutely fantastic. And any system that can actually successfully remove lies from the public sphere is a good system.
Yeah, it's great the way you're talking about that. And I remember when I first came across Kurt Doolittle, who's the originator of propertarianism. Before that, I was kind of in a place where I said, okay, I realized what the problem is in Western civilization. I just don't know how to fix it. Like, even if we could get power, you know what I mean? Even if we could take power away from the scum that are running things now, right? Okay, 2 generations later, we're going to have all the same problems. You know what I mean? Because our children or our children's children, you know, people get corrupt. I just couldn't figure out a system for stopping the same problems from happening over and over again. And so when you look at the power of something like just what you just mentioned, just this one improvement in rule of law of forcing public figures at the source. See, because, and I talk about this in one or two of my videos, I forget which ones, but if you try to just teach the masses of the public to discern truth from lie, it's very, very hard because people are busy. They got a lot to do. Even if you look at the average IQ of the population, a huge portion of the population isn't really even capable of it, even if they wanted to be. And so you have to shut down the lies at the source of the public figures who are obviously intelligent enough to figure out whether they're lying and do due diligence on their speech. So that's where you have to cut it off. And if you can do that, suddenly it becomes almost impossible for the left to operate. It becomes almost impossible for parasitic elites to operate because they have to tell these lies. And I don't know about you, Maddie, but I'm starting to feel in Western civilization like the people who lived in Eastern Europe and Russia when communism was starting to take hold must have felt, where, boy, you got to watch your mouth all the time. You can't say this, you can't say that. You got to make sure everything's along the party line.
Mm.
And then what happens is they start to get violent with anybody that speaks the truth, because it's all based on lies, right? So we have to be able to hack past that. You have to have a system that stops that before it even starts. And when I came across propertarianism and this idea you're talking about there of public figures can be punished for lying, I just said, man, this is just one of the most fantastic ideas I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah, I totally agree. And one of the things you rightly point out is that Western civilization became so dominant and so wealthy is because, well, the reason that happened is because we valued the truth above pretty much anything else. And this comes from Christianity, but also it's a function of IQ and all that kind of stuff. I think even countries like Japan, once they got onto Western values, they were able to develop fairly quickly because they've got a high IQ, slightly different culture, not as not as respecting of the truth as the West just yet, but still, it's that adherence to the truth which is what made the West the West. And what is destroying the West is the fact that we have these parasitic elites telling blatant porkies to get power and
Yeah.
wealth. And yeah,
Yes.
if we can stamp that out, then we'd go a long way to taking back our countries and actually helping the world out as well, especially if you can articulate a system that requires truth telling and you can tell the world, no, if you
Yes.
want to actually be wealthy, you have to tell the truth regardless of the consequences of that.
Yes, because it reduces the cost of doing business. I mean, if you anybody who's ever lived in a third world country, I've spent significant time in third world countries, and I mean, it's just like it's pulling teeth to get anything done. I mean, you have to bribe three people. You know, everybody's constantly trying to rip you off. You never know if they're telling you the truth, and there's no way you can build wealth or any kind of a great society in that type of environment. So, as you said, truth telling is, I would say, and I think Kurt says it as well, the number one key to our society. The way I love the way Kurt says it. He says, truth telling, Western civilization, we were the only ones that developed truth telling regardless of consequences to the status hierarchy or to the authority hierarchy, which is an amazing concept. And I haven't mentioned this in any other interviews. I'll throw it out here. I'd read the other day about how Japanese companies now, because the Japanese have been able to get a pretty good first world nation going, very good actually. But they still recognize that their culture has a weakness in this area. Their culture is very, in their culture, you don't, in these Northeastern Asian cultures, you don't say something that might offend someone who's higher than you in the hierarchy. And so what they do, I was reading about these Japanese companies, they recognize that that's a weakness. It's a competitive weakness that their people don't feel free to speak the truth. And so they purposefully hire what they call the loud American. They'll hire a loud American, and sometimes it's literally an American. I think many times it is actually a literal American, to be the guy who just blurts out the truth. Like, I don't care what any of you guys think. I don't care if this offends the CEO. This is the truth, right?
Yeah.
So it's quite a fascinating history how Western civilization developed that. And if you go to propertarianism.com and just start searching around, like just the term truth, and read some of Kurt's writings on it historically, it's fascinating why we developed that, and we were the only ones who developed that. But that's what we have to do. We have to enforce our best practices that have made us great, and not let ourselves get dragged down. And so that's one of the reasons I love that idea.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so you mentioned that you ran into Kurt Doolittle. So how did you actually come across the ideas in the first place, and what really drew you to propertarianism, other than what we've already said, and sort of where were you before that?
Sure. I've always been a reader, right? So I've been trying to, I would just say, learn how the world works for probably a good 10, 15 years now, with a lot of my free time, just reading, reading, reading. And as I said, before I came across Kurt Doolittle, when I came across Kurt Doolittle, it was on Facebook, and I honestly forget how I came across him. Must have been somebody linked him from somewhere. But this was maybe 2.5 years ago now. And before I came across him, like I said, I just didn't know how to fix the problems, really. I knew that there were some things we could do, but I didn't know how we could really fix it in the longer term. And then when I came across him, by that time I was already pretty much red pilled on most of the things that you can be red pilled on. And so, as I said, I understood the problems. I just didn't know, and I knew what some of the solutions are, because we can take power and we can just throw a bunch of policies together, right? And say, okay, we're not going to do this, we are going to do this, right? But what struck me when I came across it was this is an empirical. First of all, the ideas are based on empiricism. They're based on observation. When I look at the ideas in propertarianism, for example, the definition of property or the definition of reciprocity, I say, okay, this matches up with what my own two eyes observe. So I liked that. And then I also liked the fact that it was a very well thought out system, and not just like a hodgepodge of policies, because a hodgepodge of policies can be more easily undone than a system. And then the other thing that struck me about Kurt's writing was a lot of times it's very dense. So sometimes people will come across Kurt Doolittle's writing and they'll be like, man, this is hard to read. But it's because a lot of it you can't read fast. You got to read it slow because it's very dense. And I found myself thinking there's more helpful information in like 4 lines that this guy writes in many cases than like all sorts of entire books that I've read. And he just had another level of insight and understanding into why Western civilization has been so successful and so uniquely successful. And so that really struck me. There's another layer of understanding there. So even like my videos, right? People talk about my videos about like the ones that are titled "Why the Left Never Learns," or other videos that I've made, and they say, wow, that's just insightful. Well, a lot of that actually flows from the insights of propertarianism. And Kurt just helped me understand why what is happening. He helped me understand that better. And why Western civilization is so successful, he helped me understand that much better. And then once you start to understand these things, it's like you can see through the matrix and you're like, okay. And this is why I try to openly make predictions many times on my channel, because once you see, it's not like you can perfectly predict the future, but you understand why things are happening, so you can predict how these groups are going to react. And it's much like the New Zealand shooter there did. He said, I want to accelerate civil war because I want to do this. I'm going to do this, and this is how these groups are going to react. And he was exactly right. That's exactly how they react, because he understands them. So it just gave me another level of insight into how the world works. And that was one of the things I really appreciated about it as well.
Fantastic. Yeah. And what I like about your stuff is I go to the Propertarianism website and I read Kurt Doolittle's writing, and no offense to the guy, he's obviously extremely intelligent. It's just that his writing, as you said, is very dense and very, I think it's a little bit convoluted, but what I think that you do really well is you take the ideas that he's put down and you make them much more palatable to public consumption. So they're a lot easier to understand, and people can go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But whereas if they go to the website and actually read Doolittle's writing, they'll just be like, well, this is really, really all over the place. It's really hard to sit down and concentrate. But like you said, you've got to read it slowly and actually take it all in. But you make it a lot easier by just explaining it.
That's good to hear. That's my goal.
Normal speed. Yeah, it's the kind of thing I like to do with my channel as well. I think it comes back to, but it's basically essentially the principles of propaganda is you've got to make it as simplistic as possible so that the most number of people can understand it. And I get people coming up to me saying, well, I like your stuff because it's so simple. And I think that's really important when you're pushing ideas, that you keep them as simplistic as, so you can take complex ideas and make them easy. I think that's a skill that needs to be used a lot more in the public discourse. So I'll just ask the next question. So what's your professional background and what made you decide to start your channel?
Sure. I grew up playing music. So I started playing music very young, took lessons and all that. And so that was kind of my initial thing, is starting out playing music. And then eventually I said, okay, well, there's only a couple ways to make music. You either tour all the time, or you just hit it big, which is basically luck, and much harder to do than it seems after the fact. And I can't sing either, which is my other problem. So I said, okay, I'm gonna stop concentrating on music so much, and I'm gonna go into the business world. So I did that, and so I've been in business for a while, and got some education in business as well. So that's kind of my background. I always liked the marketing classes when I was in business school as well. And so I think that comes in handy, as you were saying, to try to just bring everything down to the simplest form possible. And it's not always possible to do that without losing some, obviously granularity and important information, but just trying to turn it into something that's easy to understand, that's catchy. So like I try to talk about parasite-proof government, right? So there's more to propertarianism than that, but that's kind of a catchy thing that sticks in people's minds. So I think taking some marketing classes and understanding some basic principles helped there. And then I decided to start my channel just because I had been following Kurt for a while. And as you said, I kind of sensed that now he's getting better and better. I think he's getting better and better at just being accessible in the way that he writes and talks. As he does it more, as he does more interviews. But I also said, I think I have an ability like you do. I have an ability to make things understandable. And so I said, I want to do something, because I have kids too. It's like, I don't want my kids to grow up in crazy social justice warrior, communism dominated world. So I have to do at least what I'm able to do. And I think this propertarianism idea or set of ideas is extremely valuable. And I think if I put it out there to the best of my ability, that hopefully it can have some impact. So I decided to start my channel. That was, I think, the very end of 2018, very beginning of 2019, around there. And it took off pretty quick. I had a few videos that got several 100,000 views because they were about hot topics, the France riots, the yellow vests and all of that. And people have been latching onto the content, and a lot of it is because the insights of propertarianism, and of course I'm throwing my own in there as well, but a lot of it is informed by the insights of Kurt and propertarianism, and the solution that propertarianism represents is really attractive to a lot of people. The ideas are very interesting to a lot of people, and obviously we're in a very volatile situation in the West politically, so there's a lot of hunger just for this type of content in general. And so it took off fairly quickly, and I've been going a little bit slower lately, working on some videos that are a little bit longer, foundational videos that people will be able to reference back, and then I hope to start getting into making some more videos that are designed to get more traffic fairly soon. But that's kind of my story.
So with your opening, a couple of people that I've seen have commented that your intro is just almost too professionally done. I tried to tell them that you could probably make that kind of video in half a day with your own camera and a tripod in the car park.
Yes.
Is that, yeah. That's what you've done, isn't it?
Yes, a lot of it is just buying a good camera, and that does half the work for you. It makes it look cool, as you probably know, as opposed to like phone camera or something. So yeah, I went out with a tripod and had my wife help me. And and then I just learned a basic video editing. I have a background in music, so I've done a lot of audio editing. Video editing is not a big leap from that, as you probably know. And I think you know how to do more stuff than I do, but I just learned how to do some basic things. And so the editing took more than a day, but yeah, the shooting was just like one afternoon, and it's not as hard as it looks. And then I basically just tried to copy some ideas that I saw in YouTube videos, or excuse me, music videos. So yeah, not as hard as it looks, but I'm glad people, I just wanted to make it memorable. I want people to remember that helmet. And as long as you remember it, even if you hate it, if you remember it, I've done my job. So.
I like your intro and your outro. I think, and I noticed you made your own music. It's funny because I actually make my own music. I love making music and doing all that kind of thing. But I'm similar. Like I can't sing, and making music it's very hard to become successful in it. You either got to get really lucky or just grind forever. Yeah. So I sort of gave up on that and thought, I like the journalism thing, so I'll just make it my own channel. So you've mentioned a few times in videos that you think that America is going to fall into a civil war. Now, obviously, you advocate for a peaceful separation. I want to know, what do you think that individuals can do in order to guide America or into a peaceful separation rather than all-out conflict. Just individuals on their own.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much individuals can do on their own. Obviously, anything like that would have to be some kind of a united effort, if that makes sense. There'd have to be people working together. One of the things that's given me a sliver of hope on that front is I came across someone on Facebook who is, I forget if it's a Facebook page or a group, but it's called Peaceful Red State Secession. And so he knows a lot of the ins and outs of the different states in the United States of America and some of the movements that people within those states are pushing to separate. Sometimes it's like part of the state, because as you probably understand the dynamic, right? There's like one big city in each one of these, in a lot of these states, right? One or two big cities, and they all the urban people vote left, and the rest of the state hates it and votes right, but they're outnumbered by the urban people all crammed into a city. So there's movements for parts of states to separate from like the big city. Like, for example, Illinois, the rest of the state could separate from Chicago, right? And Chicago could just be its own little island. So because of the political situation and because the two sides have absolutely nothing in common, there are movements like this that are, I would say, underway. And I'm not an expert enough to know how likely it is that those would actually succeed. And so that's why I refer people to this Facebook page where he knows a lot more of the details. On a macro level, I'm a little bit doubtful that it would succeed, just because I know that the powers that be, the elites, would lose a lot of power, a lot of wealth, a lot of control if they allowed a bunch of states to suddenly start seceding from the union, or seceding, the red part of the state separating from the blue part of the state. That's not something that they would want to happen. And the left is not operating in a psychology where they're going to be like, sure, you guys can just go have your own land and do your own thing. Because to them, we're Nazis. To them, that would be like letting Hitler win. So, there's big headwinds against it. I'll put it that way. And I think the chances, as far as I can tell right now, the chances of that happening are low. But I also could be wrong. There could be more of a chance of that happening than I realize. And so, I think that's one thing that somebody could do if they live in America, is if they're in a state that's like that, see if they can get involved in a movement within that state to secede or separate, whatever the case may be, and build that movement. And even if it doesn't succeed before, maybe there's a war, right? And it doesn't succeed before that, at least you're getting the word out and you're kind of memeing it into existence, if that makes sense. So we need to separate. So there's value either way.
And I think America is in a better situation than, say, places like Europe in that regards, because at least in America, you do have separate states which are separate entities. I mean, I remember you had a conversation with No White Guilt, and one of the arguments he was saying was that, well, unless you have some sort of other entity to rally behind, then it's unlikely that there's going to be some sort of conflict. But if you look at America, people could rally behind their own independent state. And if people in a state, let's say, I don't know what states are more white than others, I know that California is almost entirely Hispanic these days. But let's say you're in one of the Midwest, like I think, is it Mississippi? Is it? No, that's down south. I'm thinking of one up north, whatever it is, on the border.
Yeah, like if you have a Wyoming or an Idaho or someplace that has a lot more red people. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. Like, so you can see a state like that just turning around and having a look at what's happening in the rest of the country and saying, well, we just don't want a part of that. In Australia, we have states as well. So we've got 6 different states plus 2 territories. So there is that sort of option of ultimately separating in the end. I think it's a long way off of that ever happening. And who knows? I mean, there might be a political solution in some of these things. But what about Europe? I mean, Europe is almost, to my view, like what I can see, it's just a powder keg over there. They've imported so many foreigners, Africans, or Muslim Africans more specifically, and they're setting up enclaves and they're doing all this kind of damage to the society. And there's not really anywhere that Europeans can go. So how do you see Europe playing out?
Yeah, it's volatile for a different reason. I think you laid it out well. In America, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I understand, there's actually numerically, as far as percentage of the population, is less non-white presence in Europe than in America. In America, we're now down to about 60% white people. But as you stated very well, in Europe, a lot of this is a Muslim presence. And those people, if you go with a general, a wide generalization, they're just more badly behaved in more obvious ways. And they're an extremely intolerant religion, and they form their own no-go zones and all of this. And they have the problem with the rape gangs and all of this. So it's just more, even if you look at it, the Hispanics in America, right? Most of them are, yeah, you have your criminal elements and it is higher crime and all this, but it's not like that. You know what I mean? It's not like if you were to import that Muslims, you'd have a much bigger problem and it'd be much more of an annoyance on the population. So it's a volatile situation. Even though the numbers aren't as big, the people that are coming in are just the word I use is underclass, and I don't mean that as an insult. It's just people with lower IQs, and they're coming from this terrible culture. And low impulse control, a lot of them, this kind of thing. So it takes less. My point is, it's going to take fewer numbers to blow into a powder keg there too. And you see in Europe, some of these groups, you got people, the citizens, just taking things into their own hands, just forming, like, I don't know if you would call them militia groups or enforcement groups that go around and protect people and try to intimidate these badly behaved people into not coming or leaving, or you're not going to get away with this, or we're going to deliver retribution. And it's the whole Brent and Tarrant idea. And people are taking it into their own hands because they know their leaders are not going to do anything. So
you see a lot
I'm
of
not.
that. You see a lot of that in Eastern Europe. Sorry, yeah. You see a lot of that in especially Eastern Europe, and I think there were like Hungary and Romania. They started getting. I'm not 100%, but it was one of those countries. They started getting vigilante groups like that. So the result was the government actually did their job and closed the borders. But what I'm more worried about, not so much Eastern Europe, because as you mentioned earlier, Eastern Europe has come out of communism. So those countries tend to be a lot more nationalistic, especially places like Poland and and Estonia, and a lot of these actually what are white ethno states, as a nation is supposed to be, in my opinion. But then what I'm worried about is places like France and especially the United Kingdom, because in the United Kingdom, the people there, they just seem very cowed by the state. I mean, at least in France, you've got the yellow vests where they're standing up and saying, "No, we don't want this anymore." But then in England, they seem very weak. People in England are very worried about being called the dreaded R word for whatever reason, and it's even worse in Scotland. Strangely enough, I mean, this is Scotland, the place that produced William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, is now suddenly very afraid of being called mean names. And meanwhile, they'll tolerate the literal rape of their children and girls, like underage girls. And imagine that happening 200, 300 years ago, but now for some reason they just accept it. So what do you think is going to happen in those countries specifically? I mean, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, just an idea based on what you've seen.
Well, I think it's going to take, if you look at England and then you look at Germany, Germany has the psychological aspect of they had Hitler and they feel bad about Hitler. And that's constantly pounded into them, right? And then in England, they were an island, right? And so the further you get away from the threat, I guess you could say, like you said, these Eastern European countries, they, like Romania, right? They've lived next door to the Turks for generations and generations. So they're like, no, you're not coming in, because they know, you know what I mean? But then you go all the way over, farther away to an island, and those people, what we did as Western Europeans is we learned to extend trust, and we learned that works fantastically. But the problem is we didn't learn the limits of it. I mean, you and I know the limits, but there's still a lot of people that just are like, if we just extend trust to these people, they'll become like us, they'll become civilized, and you're an evil hater if you don't believe that. And so it's just going to take them longer. It's going to get worse and worse before the backlash comes, as compared to other places that are not operating as much in that psychology. But it's going to come. I mean, it's just going to take longer. The backlash is going to come.
It's interesting you say that because even in Spain, like Spain's essentially now, I don't think they have already. I think they've got elections coming up where I believe the hardcore nationalist parties are set to just
Mm,
destroy the election. They're going to win very easily. But then, yeah,
mm,
in England, where they've been essentially shielded from a lot of it, they
mm,
are a lot more willing to tolerate a lot of things. I think they have that English sensibility of they're a little bit too polite.
mm-hmm.
But it's interesting because I mean you're American. I don't know what whether you're Anglo or Scottish or what your heritage is, but my heritage is Anglo, and we're
Mm-hmm.
in Australia. And as I mentioned before we started the interview, Australians have the DNA of people who rose up and essentially rioted in order to turf foreigners out. So I think it's funny how long we've lasted. A lot of it has to do with subversion, but what you'll find in Australia is there are a lot of people who are speaking out about what's happening and they're talking about what's happening and they're very unhappy, very loudly voicing their opinions about things. But what they're not doing is doing it as publicly as possible. They're all doing it behind closed doors with people that they trust, and so they or maybe in a workplace where they know that they can get away with it. But
Mm-hmm.
then in the media, you get people who come out and say, "Oh, you can't say that, you can't say this, you can't say that." So it's actually suppressing the discussion of the problem whilst
Mm-hmm.
people are actually still talking about it behind closed doors anyway, which means the eventual backlash is definitely coming. I don't know how much of that happens in England. I think I don't know whether they're actually discussing things behind closed doors like that in England. Maybe in working class
Mm-hmm.
houses. I'm not so sure. I think even middle class in Australia tend to be a little bit more cucky and lefty, but definitely the lower middle class, the working class Australians have been fed up for decades. And this is
Mm-hmm.
why this guy, Fraser Anning, I don't know if you've heard of him fully, but
Yes.
he's basically burst onto the scene and he's fingers crossed he does well in the next election. I suspect he's going to do okay. But
Mm-hmm.
the reason for that is people are talking about all these issues, especially in Australia. We're a lot less shy about talk about race. Obviously, Islam is even something that people in England are talking about now. But I
Mm-hmm.
think, yeah, that's you point out that there's probably going to be a reaction. It just the question is how that reaction manifests itself.
Yeah, and it'll be very interesting for me to watch Europe, and I love hearing you talk about Australia a little bit as well, because I'm going to put this on my, I'm going to spread this around as much as I can on my social media. And you were telling me beforehand about how Fraser Anning, I think you said he started his political party just recently, a couple years
Yep.
ago, a couple
A
weeks
day.
ago.
So he started 2 weeks ago. So the Australian Electoral Commission, who register parties, were delaying, and then it's funny because he was censured by the Senate. Now, if you don't know what a censure is, that's where the Senate just voted to say you're a very naughty boy, Fraser. It doesn't mean much more than that. They all had a very big debate about how much of a naughty boy Fraser was for saying things. And on the same day that he was censured, his party got registered, and literally the next day he had over 1,000 members. Don't know how many members he's got yet. They haven't reported it. The last report was 1,000, and the sources that I've seen indicate that it's potentially quite a large number, but that isn't actually confirmed at the time of recording yet.
But give that context, because you said the largest political party in Australia actually only has 50,000
Yeah,
actual members,
yeah,
right?
that's
So
correct. So yeah,
1,000, yeah, go ahead.
so the largest parties, the two biggest parties, have 40 and 50,000 thereabouts, and the third largest party only has 10,000. So it's
Mm.
quite significant to get 1,000 in one day.
Yeah. So what this tells me, and this was fascinating to hear you tell, because I was aware of Fraser Anning, how he got egged. Many people have seen the video, and you actually have a video on your channel of him, because you were right there physically when he
Yeah,
got egged. And I've
yeah, I
seen
was
this,
right there. I interviewed him as well straight after. If you want to go and
oh,
watch that.
yeah, yeah, people can go watch that. I was not aware of that until you let me know, but
Mm.
that's fantastic. And but I've seen that interaction going around our circles in America as well. Some of the biggest blogs and everything, everybody talking about it. But that's, I said to you beforehand, we need somebody like that in America who's somewhat to the right of Trump, right? And so this is what we're talking, what you and I are talking about here. The way this manifests is there's huge pent up demand for political leadership. And then somebody steps up and meets that demand and is willing to go public with it. And then there's immediate rush of support. So Trump was a version of this, obviously, where everybody thought, oh, he's just so horrible, right? But then he wins the election. It shows that half the voting public prefers him to the politically correct crazy people. So that's a huge, when breakthroughs like that happen, it's huge for us. So Fraser Anning, if he can get support, somebody like that, and then what we see our enemies doing is they're just rushing to censor everything, or like you said, censor Fraser Anning in the Senate. You're a very, very bad person. Or like in the European Union now, they're I don't know all the details, but they're shutting down the memes, right? They're shutting down any talk on social media. They're just rushing to, it's basically communism. You can't say this, you can't say this, you can't say this, to try to shove their will down everybody's throat, which in turn, as you were saying, then increases the demand even more for political leadership. So in America, the situation we have in America is we just are out of time because of immigration. Very soon, as I say like 1,000 times in every single one of my videos, so I'm sorry for people if people are sick of hearing it, but very soon the right wing's not going to be able to win any elections just because of the sheer volume of non-white immigration, and most of them vote left. So that may not be the case in Europe or in Australia, to where if you can have a Fraser Anning or people that step up and fill that political void as far as leadership, that it can build more and more momentum as people get more and more sick of the garbage from the immigration issue and all of that. So it all depends on, I'm not an expert on Europe or Australia, but I'm very fascinated with those areas as well. Is there a political solution in those places?
I like to think that there's a political solution. I want there to be a political solution, and I do honestly believe that there could be a political solution to it all, especially if white people are able to start voting as a bloc. So what you'll see, especially in Australia is what the elites have termed the world's most successful multicultural society, which is what they love to push that down our throats, which is funny because multiculturalism has just increased crime and congestion. Yes. Even in Australia, we have Eastern Europeans, especially the Chinese, a lot of Chinese come in, and when they become citizens, they tend to vote as a bloc. And then you've got the Middle Eastern Muslims who all tend to vote as a bloc. So these are individuals, and politicians act like they vote as a bloc as well. So they'll talk about, oh, you said this about the Chinese community, you said this about the Turkish community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one thing you never hear about is people representing the European community. And what Fraser Anning represents is at least the start of a movement towards European descended individuals voting as a bloc together and voting in their own ethnic interests, which is something that it's been suppressed in whites a big time, apart, like you said, our pathological altruism, which has been exploited by parasitic elites, but also because it's just not something that we've naturally done. We're in our own countries, so we haven't seen the need to vote as an ethnic bloc. But as our nations become more ethnically divided along, especially the tribal lines and religious lines and all these lines, it's going to be far more important for whites to vote as a bloc together and in their own interests, if we are even to have a chance at saving our own country through political means. If we don't do that, I think a conflict and separation is essentially inevitable. But if we can actually manage to get white people to start voting in those ways and actually thinking in those ways as well, which is just as important, it's actually probably more important, then you do have a political solution, because then you can get whites all pulling in the same direction. And when that happens, we tend to do fairly good things in the world, such as, ending slavery and all that kind of stuff, which, when we work together, we manage to do a lot of great things. I'm not sure why the elites hate us so much. Maybe they just don't like people.
Well, that's very well said. I completely agree. And what you said there right at the end, I think is an important point as well, and it's just started to percolate to the front of my mind more in recent days, and a lot of it is because of an interview I did the other night recently, and I'm going to be linking to it as well from my socials as well, so people can look for that. But with a guy named Adam was interviewing me, and he was talking about, he made the point, and I pretty much agree with it, that a lot of this, of what the elites are doing, of trying to shove multiculturalism down our throat, because you and I sit here and think, why are they doing this? Like, how stupid can you be? Like, do you actually think this is going to work? Of course it's not. So why are they doing it? Well, a lot of it is just short-term financial incentives.
That's correct.
If you have more people coming into, it's the mindset of a business owner. If as soon as you own a business, you just want more warm bodies to buy your stuff, to buy whatever your business is selling, to use the service. And the quickest way to get warm bodies into a civilized rule of law system is just to import warm bodies into where the civilized rule of law system already exists, and hope that the people that are, the heritage people that were already there don't slit your throat, so that's the bet they're making. But I don't think these elites, some people talk about the Illuminati and all this, and I'm not saying there's no collusion or plan. I don't know, it's hard to prove or disprove, but a lot of this is just short-term financial incentive. Like, why would any business owner want to close the borders when their profit just goes up and up and up, just because more people come in, and it drives down the cost of labor, and it is more warm bodies to buy your stuff. So a lot of it is just that, and the people, the white people, just have to basically find a way to put their foot down and say, no, you are not going to do this to our civilization. Because the other thing that happens, I want to make a video, Maddie, at some point that's basically talking to the business elite. Okay, CEOs, what is your game plan, folks? It's at least in America, because very soon the right wing's not going to win any more elections. You've had the right wing to come in and save the day, and save you from the unions, and save you from super high corporate tax rates, and save you from all this. That's not going to happen anymore when Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and those types of people win all the elections. What's your game plan? I don't think they have a game plan. I think they're just going for the next quarter's profits.
I totally agree with you with regards to that side of politics, and I'm sure you would agree with me when I say that it's not just that side. It's actually, I think it's an alliance of the globalist corporatists and the globalist communists. So with the globalist communists, they just want to flood us with non-white migrants to essentially get rid of white people. I think they actually want to do that. But then you're right about the corporatists on what you could call the right, I guess, but they're all sort of the same thing. For Australia, so in America's a similar situation. You had a financial crisis in 2008, which wasn't fully resolved. Australia is actually in an even worse situation. I also did a video on this. If anyone watching this hasn't seen it yet, it's about the Australia's massive housing bubble. It's in my economics series there. So Australia's got one of the world's biggest ever housing bubbles, and a lot of that is due to restrictive urban boundaries and central banking, ultimately, where the banks let a lot of money just flow into the system, and all these other businesses go and use that money they build houses, and banks get rich, etc. And it's the wealth effect. The wealth effect is when your property prices go up, people feel wealthier, so they spend more, etc., etc., etc. One of the things that Australia has are these big international land developers who they'll come in, they'll buy up huge tracts of land and put cheap housing all over the place. So a guy I know, Blair Cottrell, who's one of the most censored people in Australia, he's a carpenter. He works for all of them, and he talks about this. So what they'll do, they'll build all these really cheap houses for $200,000-$300,000, $200,000 I think is how much they cost to make, and then they'll sell them, because housing prices are so high, for $700,000-$800,000. They sell thousands of these a year. The problem for them is they don't have enough white customers. So what they do is they get the government to bring in hundreds of thousands of people a year to buy their houses. And it's that pure parasitism, just pure, like, it's almost worse than parasitism. It's almost a cancer on our system, where they are a cancerous tumor latching to the system and using the government to import customers purely for more people. Like, it's not like they're just selling products like, new cars or bikes where they're actually making it. They're just making houses, which is not like, it's just a house. It's not like
Yeah.
someone needs to live there. I mean, people need houses to live, but it's not like they're investing in factories or mines or some sort of
Yeah.
productive endeavor. They're just building houses. And yeah, it adds to the economy for that one house, but it also, because they need all these people to come and buy them, it just ends up destroying our cities. Like Melbourne's traffic used to be all right. It's now worse than New York, according to a lot of things. And I lived here in Melbourne. I used to drive Uber, and I can tell you over the last sort of even 5 years, traffic has gone from being horrible to just unbearable.
Mm. Yeah, that's a perfect example. The way you said it is so perfect. It's just they're just importing people so they can just sell them a house. I mean, it's that simple, right? And they're using the government to do it, and they have the money to. And that's that's what I talk about. Our system is totally broken. I don't know how the system is in Australia, but I imagine it's similar. In America, the money people can just buy the politicians. That's how it works, and the politicians do whatever they want. And so none of the politicians are going to close the border, including Trump. None of them are going to do it because all of the money people are like, if you do that, we're going to lose so much money. And nobody's stepping in and saying, listen, our country is going to implode. Like a lot of people are going to die because there's going to be a war. Like nobody's stepping in with any kind of a common sense. And if you say it, you just get called a Nazi. And so that's why I'm like, in America, at least, this is deterministic. I mean, nobody's going to stop this. Unless by some miracle, some amazing leader steps up and says all the right things and makes everybody happy, which I just can't see happening. And then in Australia, it's can you do it electorally? That's my question. Is in Europe or certain places in Europe, like you see in Italy, right? Salvini, it's great. Some of these Eastern European countries because they're just more based. They're less cucked out. But maybe in Australia there can be. But at some point, the people just have to say, you can't do this to us. And this is what I like about propertarianism as well, the more full and complete definition of property, because under propertarianism, the people have recourse in matters of what Kurt Doolittle calls the commons. So if you look at an elite that's saying, well, all this immigration is making the economy go gangbusters, it's awesome. Well, they're cherry picking property. Do you know what I'm saying? They're cherry picking one form of property that's important to them. And they're trampling all over and being a parasite upon, as you so eloquently put it, all sorts of other things that the people value. And so in our current system, the people have no recourse against that. In proprietarian law, that would be addressed. It would be fixed to where the people can go and say, no, this is actually a form of property that we value, and you can't just trample all over it because you want to increase the value of your form of property by being a parasite on mine. And it's not just physical property, it's the crime rate. You can't just increase the crime rate in our city so you can make more money. That type of idea.
That's correct. It's interesting the different situations as well, because I look at America and it's almost hard to see an electoral change in America just because of the way that the system is set up, the two-party system. It seems that the Republicans and the Democrats basically dominate everything. Therefore, you'd need someone to essentially infiltrate the Republican Party in order to do something. But in Australia and in a lot of places in Europe, it's a little bit different. So we have two houses of parliament, just like in America, but we use a preferential system so that you vote in the lower house, which is for individual seats, in different areas. But in the upper house, it's statewide, and essentially parties that get a certain percentage of votes get seats. So if you are a party that gets, say, 5 to 10% of the vote, you're still going to get maybe 2 to 5 seats or 2 to 6 seats or whatever it is, depending on preferences and all that kind of thing. And that means that you can essentially have a minor party controlling the balance of power in the Senate. So in the lower house, you're going to have the major parties dominating the lower house. That is to say, in Australia, there's a lot of independents who are actually coming into lower house seats now as well. So the major parties are their primary votes just basically dropping through the floor. It's the last time it was this low in Australia, we got a new political party, which was a Liberal Party, which was founded by Robert Menzies, who openly stated that he was a supporter of the White Australia policy and wanted to keep it forever. But that being said, we're looking at now where you can have someone potentially like Fraser Anning or even another nationalistic party win several seats in the upper house and control supply. So the only way that the major parties could do stuff, could actually pass laws, is if they work together as the major parties, which would serve to prove to the people that the major parties are just a uniparty at this stage, which I think is happening in a number of places in Europe.
yeah.
I think it's even in Sweden, especially, where the Swedish Democrats ended up controlling the balance, but the major parties, the traditional parties, just allied together anyway, and it's probably all going to fall apart there. That's just one example, but that's what could happen in Australia. I don't know how that would happen in America. Maybe you could explain a potential solution with that regards. But one thing about America that Americans have that other countries don't have is the right to bear arms. Now, we had our right to bear arms stolen off us based on what a lot of people rightly, I believe, was essentially a lie. And even the facts about gun control indicate that gun control fails anyway. But at least in America, you have the right to bear arms. And I was having this discussion with someone a little while ago, a few weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago, where they said that America may not have a civil war, probably won't have a civil war. His argument was because Americans are so armed. It's like that Sun Tzu saying, if you want peace, prepare for war. Was it Sun Tzu or some maybe I think it might have been a Roman general, Tacitus or something like that.
I forget who it was, but yes.
Yeah. If you want peace, prepare for war. So because Americans are so prepared for war, perhaps that means it's less likely to be a civil war situation and more likely to be a peaceful separation. So what do you actually think about that?
That's an interesting question. I think that would be true, possibly, except for the fact that the left in America, as you put it, I forget how you said it. You said it very well. The communists, basically.
They just call them communists. That's all they are.
Yeah, that's what they are, exactly. Why not just call them that? The communists, who are allied with the parasitic elites, both of those groups are operating in short-term incentives, and in the case of the communists, just outright instinct. And so the way I put it is they can't help themselves. The business people, the parasitic elites, they just need more money, right? And so they're just kind of operating in that. And then the communists are operating in these instincts that I talk about in my videos, and they cannot help themselves. And so they don't have the capability to step back and say, you know what, if we keep doing this, the grassroots right is going to get out the guns. They don't have the capability of doing that. And I've tested this on Facebook with people who are left wingers, and I just say there's going to be a war in this country because pretty soon the people with all the guns are not going to be able to win any more elections. And they're just like, oh, the military is just going to go in and take care of that. I'm like, you're dreaming, man. You do not have a single realistic brain cell in your whole brain. These people are incapable of stopping themselves from doing what comes instinctively to them. So that's why I wish that was true. I would love it if that was true, but I don't think it is.
And that's one of the saving graces for even the right in Australia, we'll call it the nationalist populist side of politics, even in Australia, is that a lot of the military, or most of the military, tend to be white men, and white men tend to be far more nationalistic, which I think is why there's a massive push, especially in Australia and England, to get non-white men into the military and to the police. Yes. I think even in UK,
absolutely.
And I think it's almost like the elites have kind of thought, oh shit, we have too many white men in here. Then what happens if something does hit the fan and they end up rising up? I don't know. It's all very interesting. I hope that there is no war. I did have one more question. I was only planning on going half an hour, but the conversation was interesting. So I
haven't even looked at the time. I've been having fun.
Oh yeah, no, it's been good. I want to keep it to about an hour. We don't want the content to go for too long. But yeah, it's been a really good discussion. I did have one final question that everyone wants to know: are you a Fed?
I am not a Fed. I don't know how I could prove that to you. What I would invite people to do is it's funny because when that thing with no white guilt happened, and everybody started saying Kurt Doolittle's a Fed. I'm like, I mean, I can understand people saying I'm a Fed because they don't know much about me and I'm, hiding behind a motorcycle mask. But Kurt Doolittle, I mean, look at his background. He's like a multi-millionaire successful entrepreneur, sold companies to Microsoft, and then he spent like the last 6-7 years on Facebook in public writing these long effort posts on Facebook, like every single day, right? Working out this philosophy and all of this. I'm like, that's not how a Fed, like if Kurt Doolittle's a Fed, I'm the Queen of England. I mean, it's just,
too complicated.
It's ridiculous.
His ideology is too complicated.
Man is going to come up with this. Like, it's just not going to happen.
And he's far too spurgy to be a Fed for my mind, but who knows?
Yeah.
You can never prove it.
I just assume everybody's a Fed and assume nobody's a Fed. And to me, the only thing the audience can do if they're not sure is just say, is this person speaking the truth? And, you know, I'm not telling people to go out and start stuff, man. I mean, if there's any way to do this peacefully and just have some sanity rule the day, great. But I'm also realistic with people and saying, I don't think the chances of that are good, at least in America. So be prepared, you know. But yeah, that's a good question. It's funny.
Yeah, that's right. I had to ask because people are going to be saying, "Oh, he's a." I guarantee. I had comments on my Propertarian video. You know, he's a Fed, don't you? Well, I think if you were Fed posting, you'd be more calling for action rather than saying, "No, we don't want this to happen." I think that's the case. And like I said in the video, if you are worried about it, then the solution is very simple. Just don't ever call for violence, and don't say that any good can come from it, and say that you are 100% in support of a peaceful political solution to our issues. And I agree with that. I definitely don't want a war. I mean, you've got kids, you don't want a war either. It's extremely against everyone's interests for any kind of physical conflict. That's why animals developed ritualized combat. You know, even insects have ritualized combat. It's in order to stop damage to happening to either party. It's a totally natural thing to want to avoid conflict, and I think that we need to be doing what we can to do that. But again, we don't control the timeline. The timeline controls us. So there's not much else that we can do other than keep telling the truth, and that's the best antidote to lies, in my opinion.
Yeah, just keep telling the truth and just preparing people, waking people up. And the more we read people, I mean, we forget sometimes, you and I in our circles, how many, like even in America, how many people that are a part of what I call the grassroots right, you know, maybe they're a Trump voter and they don't even understand half of the stuff that we understand. So every effort we can make to red pill people, wake them up, to help people understand why the right wing has been losing, so we can fix these problems. That's all very valuable. And, you know, the other thing I would say is if the point comes in America, for example, where people start acting, they're not going to be talking about it on Facebook. They're just going to do it, you know? So I just want to try to wake as many people up as possible.
Actually, I mean, we could have spoken about censorship a bit more, which I think is why censorship is just so dangerous. Censorship is probably the worst thing that the ruling class could do at this point, because people aren't going to change their mind just because you've told them that they can't talk about it on Facebook. They're just going to meet in real life. And
exactly,
it's going to make matters a hell of a lot worse and a lot more dangerous for everyone, especially the people in charge. But I think free speech is very important, that we do all we can to protect it, and hopefully we can get through this current bout of censorship and start telling the truth without fear of being shut down. Otherwise, Mr. John Mark, the man with the red motorcycle helmet, everyone should go and check out his channel. It will be linked in the description. It's just John Mark. He's the guy with the red helmet, as you can see on this discussion. Go watch his videos. Go check out propertarianism.com. You could, if you're still on Fastbook, then you can go and listen to Kurt Doolittle. Are you on Gab, by the way? Have you set up a Gab account?
I do have a Gab account. I hardly ever post on it except for when I put out a video, and half the time I forget to do that. So I need to get more involved on there. Yeah,
get on Gab. I'm all over Gab. I think it's great because it's just a community, really, because it's all the people that have been censored by Twitter and Facebook. Yeah. So a lot of libertarian-minded people, strangely, not a lot of Nazis, as far as I can tell. There are some, yeah. Anyway, thank you again for taking the time to join us from across the Pacific. Everyone else, I hope you enjoyed this video. We will see you when we are looking right in your eyeballs.
That's all I've got for you right now. I love you all. Till next time.